Hi everybody, and welcome back to Old Stories to Fall Asleep to. Before we begin tonight's story, if you enjoy history told through stories like this, please consider subscribing. And I would love to hear from you as well. Where are you listening from tonight, and what are you doing while you listen? Are you relaxing after work? Getting ready for bed? Driving home? Or listening from somewhere else entirely? Let me know down in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. Now, tonight, we are exploring one of history's most surprising endings. Because the Vikings did not disappear. The people remained. Families continued farming along the coasts of Scandinavia. Fishermen still launched their boats into cold northern waters. Children still grew up in the same villages their grandparents had known. And yet, within a few generations, the Viking world was gone. The longships still existed, but fewer sailed in search of plunder. The old gods were still remembered, but churches were becoming more common. Powerful chieftains were giving way to powerful kings. The sea still connected distant lands, but it was increasingly carrying merchants instead of raiders. The change happened so gradually that most people never noticed it. There was no single day when the Viking Age ended. No messenger arrived with the news. No village gathered to witness the passing of an era. Instead, history moved quietly through the lives of ordinary people. A farmer adapting to new customs. A merchant returning home with unfamiliar ideas. A child growing up in a world slightly different from the one his grandparents had known. Each change seemed small. Together, they transformed an entire civilization. And that is the story we will follow tonight. Not the story of how the Vikings disappeared, but the story of how the Vikings changed. And how that change slowly brought one of history's most famous ages to an end. To understand how the Viking Age ended, we first need to understand why it began. The answer was not a powerful king or a great battle. It was opportunity. More than 1,000 years ago, the people of Scandinavia lived in a world shaped by mountains, forests, and cold northern seas. Life could be difficult, and many communities were separated by rugged terrain. Yet the sea connected them. Boats carried fishermen to their catches, merchants to their customers, and travelers to neighboring settlements. Generation after generation, people learned how to navigate coastal waters and build stronger vessels. Most never imagined they were preparing for a new chapter in history. They were simply adapting to the world around them. At the same time, stories from distant lands began reaching Scandinavia. Travelers spoke of wealthy towns, busy markets, and opportunities beyond the horizon. Silver, fine goods, and foreign objects occasionally arrived with merchants, offering small glimpses of a much larger world. For many people, especially the young, such stories were difficult to ignore. Some hoped to trade. Some hoped to explore. Some hoped to acquire land or wealth that seemed out of reach at home. What mattered was that more and more people began looking outward. The sea was no longer just part of everyday life. It became a pathway to possibility. That simple change in perspective would have enormous consequences. Once Scandinavian sailors started venturing farther from home, they would encounter new opportunities, new dangers, and new worlds. In the centuries that followed, their journeys would reshape not only Scandinavia, but much of Europe as well. The Viking Age began when ordinary people decided to see what lay beyond the horizon. As Scandinavian sailors ventured farther from home, the world around them began to expand. What started as coastal travel gradually became longer journeys across open water. Sailors explored unfamiliar routes, visited distant settlements, and returned with knowledge that made future voyages easier. Each journey made the next one possible. Merchants discovered new trading partners. Explorers found islands and coastlines unknown to their communities. News traveled back to Scandinavia along with valuable goods and stories from distant lands. For ordinary families, these changes created new opportunities. A farmer might sell goods to a trader heading overseas. A young man could join a voyage and return with wealth that would have been difficult to acquire at home. Communities that once felt isolated became connected to wider networks of trade and exchange. Not everyone who sailed was searching for adventure. Many were searching for opportunity. The growing trade routes linked Scandinavia to places across Europe and beyond. Silver flowed north. Foreign goods appeared in local markets. Wealth began accumulating in the hands of successful traders, chieftains, and shipowners. As prosperity increased, so did ambition. More people wanted access to the opportunities that lay beyond the horizon. More ships were built. More voyages were organized. And not all of them were peaceful. Some sailors discovered that wealth could be acquired more quickly through raiding than through trade. Coastal monasteries, towns, and settlements often possessed valuables but limited defenses. The temptation was difficult for some to resist. Soon, Scandinavian ships were arriving on foreign shores for many different reasons. Some came to trade. Some came to settle. Some came to raid. Together, these journeys marked the beginning of a new era, one that would soon make the Vikings known throughout Europe. As Viking ships appeared more frequently beyond Scandinavia, their reputation began to spread. In some places, they arrived as traders carrying goods and seeking profit. In others, they arrived as raiders searching for wealth. The same ship that traded peacefully in one harbor might appear as a threat in another. This mixture of trade and raiding helped shape the Viking world. One of the most famous early raids took place in the year 793 at Lindisfarne, a monastery on the northeastern coast of England. The attack shocked many people at the time and later became one of the events most closely associated with the beginning of the Viking Age. Yet the story of the Vikings was always larger than raids alone. Across northern Europe, trade networks continued to grow. Scandinavian merchants traveled vast distances, exchanging furs, amber, iron, and other goods for silver and luxury items from abroad. As wealth flowed back into Scandinavia, communities began to change. Small settlements expanded into trading centers. More ships filled the harbors. People who once spent their entire lives close to home now encountered travelers from distant regions. The world felt larger than it had before. For ordinary families, opportunities were increasing. Successful voyages could bring wealth, status, and connections that earlier generations had never imagined. At the same time, growing trade linked Scandinavia more closely to the rest of Europe. New goods arrived. New ideas arrived. And in the years ahead, those ideas would prove just as important as the silver carried home by returning merchants. The Viking Age was reaching its height. But the connections that helped it flourish would also begin changing it from within. As Scandinavia became more connected to the outside world, change arrived alongside prosperity. Merchants returned home with silver, fine cloth, jewelry, and other valuable goods. But they also carried something less visible: ideas. In growing trading centers such as Hedeby and Birka, people encountered travelers from many different cultures. Goods exchanged hands, but so did stories, customs, and beliefs. For ordinary people, these encounters often seemed small. A foreign merchant describing a distant kingdom. A traveler speaking a different language. An unfamiliar symbol carved onto a piece of jewelry. Yet over time, these small moments began to reshape Scandinavian society. Among the new influences arriving from abroad was Christianity. By this time, Christianity had already spread across much of Europe. As trade expanded, Scandinavian merchants and rulers increasingly interacted with Christian communities. At first, the new religion appeared only at the edges of Viking society. Most people continued to honor the traditional Norse gods. Stories of Odin, Thor, and Freya remained an important part of everyday life. But Christianity continued to spread. Some rulers saw advantages in building relationships with Christian kingdoms. Some merchants encountered the faith during their travels. Missionaries gradually arrived in Scandinavia, hoping to win converts. The change was slow. A generation might grow up following one set of beliefs, while their children encountered another. Few people could have predicted where these changes would lead. Yet the growing connections between Scandinavia and the wider European world were beginning to transform the foundations of Viking society. And in time, those transformations would prove far more powerful than any raid or battlefield victory. The spread of Christianity did not happen overnight. For generations, old and new beliefs existed side by side. In some communities, people still told stories of Odin and Thor while also becoming familiar with Christian teachings. Traditions that had been passed down for centuries remained important, even as new ideas arrived from abroad. For ordinary families, these changes were often gradual rather than dramatic. A traveler might return home with a different view of the world. A local ruler might support the construction of a church. Children could grow up learning customs that seemed unfamiliar to their grandparents. At the same time, another change was taking place. The rulers of Scandinavia were becoming more powerful. For much of the Viking Age, local chieftains held significant influence within their communities. Their authority often depended on personal loyalty, reputation, and success. But as wealth increased and trade expanded, some rulers gained the resources needed to extend their power over larger territories. Kingdoms began to take shape. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, rulers sought greater control over land, trade routes, and rival leaders. They collected taxes, strengthened their authority, and built institutions that could govern larger populations. For many ordinary people, this brought greater stability. Yet it also meant that the world was becoming more organized and less independent than before. The old Viking way of life had thrived in a society where local leaders held much of the power and individuals could pursue opportunities across distant seas. Now, that society was beginning to change. Stronger kingdoms and new religious traditions were gradually creating a different kind of Scandinavia. And although few people realized it at the time, these developments were quietly laying the foundations for the end of the Viking Age. As the kingdoms of Scandinavia grew stronger, the balance of power began to shift. In earlier generations, a successful Viking might gain wealth through trade, exploration, or raiding. Local chieftains often had considerable freedom, and ambitious individuals could build influence through their own efforts. But stronger kings increasingly wanted that power for themselves. Rulers in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden worked to bring more territory under their control. They demanded loyalty from local leaders, collected taxes, and strengthened royal authority. For ordinary people, these changes could be felt in everyday life. Laws became more organized. Trade routes became more secure. Disputes that might once have been settled locally were increasingly influenced by royal power. Many of these developments brought stability. A merchant preferred safer roads and harbors. A farmer benefited from greater order. Communities often prospered when conflict was reduced. Yet there was another consequence. The conditions that had encouraged Viking raiding were slowly disappearing. A king who wanted steady tax revenue had little interest in uncontrolled violence. Trade produced wealth more reliably than raiding, and peaceful relations with neighboring kingdoms could be more valuable than conflict. Gradually, rulers began directing their resources towards strengthening their kingdoms rather than supporting independent expeditions. The wider world was changing as well. Across Europe, kingdoms were becoming stronger and better organized. Coastal communities improved their defenses. Wealth was no longer as easy to seize as it had been in earlier centuries. The opportunities that had fueled the rise of the Vikings were becoming less common. Without realizing it, Scandinavia and the rest of Europe were moving toward a new era. And with each passing generation, the world that had once rewarded Viking raiders was becoming harder to find. As Europe became more organized and better defended, raiding grew increasingly difficult. In earlier centuries, a small fleet of ships could sometimes catch a coastal community by surprise. Monasteries, villages, and trading centers often had limited protection, making them tempting targets. But those conditions did not last forever. Kingdoms learned from experience. Coastal defenses improved. Armies became stronger. Rulers devoted more resources to protecting their territories and responding to attacks. Places that had once seemed vulnerable were now far more difficult to threaten. For Scandinavian sailors seeking wealth, the risks were growing. A voyage that might once have produced valuable rewards could now end in failure or defeat. The balance between danger and opportunity was changing. At the same time, trade continued to offer benefits. Merchants could build fortunes through commerce. Expanding towns created new markets. Stronger kingdoms provided greater stability for economic growth. For many people, trade simply made more sense than raiding. As a result, the image of success gradually began to change. Earlier generations might have admired a warrior returning from a distant expedition. Increasingly, however, wealth and influence could be gained through trade, land ownership, or service to a king. The ambitions of young people started to change as well. Some still dreamed of adventure, but more opportunities now existed closer to home. A growing economy offered paths that did not require crossing dangerous seas in search of uncertain rewards. The transformation was slow, unfolding over many decades. Most people living through it probably did not notice any single turning point. Yet the cumulative effect was significant. The society that had once encouraged Viking expansion was becoming a different kind of society. And as old opportunities faded and new ones emerged, the Viking world continued its gradual transformation. As opportunities within Scandinavia continued to grow, the meaning of success began to change. During the early Viking Age, wealth often came from movement. Traders traveled long distances. Explorers searched for new lands. Raiders sought valuable goods beyond their homeland. The sea offered possibilities that many people could not find at home. But by the 11th century, Scandinavia was becoming more prosperous and more connected than it had been before. Towns were growing. Trade networks were expanding. Kingdoms were becoming stronger. For many families, opportunities no longer required a journey across the sea. Land became increasingly valuable. Successful merchants established themselves in growing towns. Service to kings and local rulers offered influence and security. The paths to wealth were changing. So were the values of society. A generation raised during the height of Viking expansion might admire the stories of famous voyages and distant adventures. Their children, however, were growing up in a world where stability often brought greater rewards than risk. This shift affected everyday life in countless ways. Communities became more settled. Trade became more important. Local institutions gained influence. People invested more energy in strengthening the places where they lived rather than seeking fortunes elsewhere. None of this happened suddenly. The old stories remained popular. Longships still crossed northern waters. Scandinavian merchants continued traveling to distant markets. Yet the culture was evolving. The qualities that once helped create the Viking Age were gradually giving way to new priorities. And as this transformation unfolded, events beyond Scandinavia were creating another challenge. Across the North Sea, England was changing as well. The relationship between England and the Viking world had shaped centuries of history. Now, that relationship was about to enter its final chapter. England had long been one of the most important destinations for Viking activity. For generations, Scandinavian ships had crossed the North Sea to trade, raid, settle, and sometimes rule. Viking influence became so strong that large parts of England eventually fell under Scandinavian control. The result was not simply conflict. Over time, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived alongside one another, traded with one another, and influenced each other's cultures. In many regions, the boundary between conqueror and local population gradually became less clear. Yet political power in England never remained stable for long. As English rulers worked to strengthen their kingdoms, they sought to reclaim authority over territories that had once been controlled by Viking leaders. The struggle for power continued across generations. For ordinary people, these conflicts could be deeply disruptive. Farmers worried about armies moving through their lands. Merchants faced uncertainty when trade routes became unsafe. Families often found themselves living through political changes they had little ability to influence. At the same time, England itself was becoming more organized and more unified. Stronger governments could collect resources more effectively, raise larger armies, and defend their territories more successfully than before. This made future Viking campaigns increasingly difficult. The conditions that had allowed earlier generations of raiders to achieve dramatic successes were slowly disappearing. Even when Scandinavian rulers gained victories, maintaining control became far more challenging than it had once been. The balance of power was changing. For centuries, the Viking world had expanded outward, finding opportunities in neighboring lands. Now those lands were growing stronger and more capable of resisting outside influence. The age of easy expansion was coming to an end. Yet many leaders in Scandinavia still dreamed of restoring the successes of the past. Before the Viking Age entered its final chapter, there was one last period when Scandinavian power seemed stronger than ever. That period was closely connected to a ruler known as Knut the Great. In the early 11th century, Knut built a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and, for a time, Norway. His rule linked territories that had long been connected through trade, migration, and warfare. To many people living at the time, it may have appeared that Viking influence had reached its peak. Trade flourished across the North Sea. Wealth flowed through ports and markets. Connections created by earlier generations now supported a powerful political network. For ordinary people, this often meant greater stability. Merchants benefited from safer trade routes. Communities experienced periods of peace that allowed economic activity to grow. Families could focus more on daily life and less on conflict. Yet beneath this success lay a problem. Empires are often easier to build than to maintain. Much of Knut's authority depended on his own leadership and ability to balance competing interests across several kingdoms. When Knut died in 1035, those challenges quickly became apparent. Rivalries emerged. Alliances weakened. Different regions pursued their own interests. The empire that had seemed so powerful began to fragment. For many people, daily life continued much as before. Markets remained active and communities carried on with their routines. But the political structure that had united much of the Viking world was becoming less stable. What appeared to be the height of Viking influence would later prove to be one of its last great successes. And as the empire faded, new struggles for power began to emerge across the North Sea. As Knut's empire weakened, the Viking world entered a period of uncertainty. The connections that still linked Scandinavia, England, and other parts of Northern Europe remained important, but political unity was fading. Without a strong ruler holding the empire together, competing interests quickly resurfaced. Different kingdoms pursued their own goals. local rulers sought greater influence. Old rivalries returned. For ordinary people, these changes were often felt indirectly. Merchants had to navigate shifting political conditions. Communities adapted to new leaders and changing alliances. Families continued their daily lives while larger struggles unfolded around them. The fragmentation of power created instability, but it also revealed how much the Viking world had changed. Earlier generations had expanded outward with remarkable energy, opening trade routes and establishing settlements across vast distances. Now, much of that energy was being directed toward managing kingdoms, defending territories, and resolving political disputes closer to home. The priorities were different. Expansion was no longer the driving force it had once been. At the same time, the kingdoms of Europe continued to strengthen. Governments became more organized, armies more effective, and borders more clearly defined. The world that had allowed Viking expansion to flourish was becoming harder to find. Yet not everyone accepted this new reality. There were still leaders who looked back to the great achievements of earlier generations and believed that one more ambitious campaign could restore the power and prestige of the past. Among them was a Norwegian king whose name would become closely associated with the final years of the Viking Age. His name was Harald Hardrada, and his ambitions would lead to one of the most famous turning points in medieval history. Harald Hardrada was one of the most remarkable figures of the Viking Age. Long before he became king of Norway, he had lived a life filled with adventure. As a young man, he fought in distant lands, traveled widely, and accumulated both wealth and experience far from home. His story might have sounded familiar to earlier generations of Vikings. Like many before him, Harald sought opportunity beyond the borders of Scandinavia. He spent years serving as a warrior abroad and returned with the reputation of a skilled leader. When he eventually became king of Norway, Harald inherited a world that was very different from the one that had existed at the beginning of the Viking Age. Scandinavia was more connected, more organized, and more influenced by Christianity. Stronger kingdoms now dominated much of northern Europe. Yet Harald remained ambitious. He believed that Norway could play a greater role in the affairs of the North Sea. Like other rulers before him, he looked toward England, a land that had shaped so much of Viking history. Across the sea, a dispute over the English throne created an opportunity. Harald decided to act. In 1066, he assembled a large force and sailed toward England. For many of the men who joined him, the expedition must have seemed like a chance to achieve glory, wealth, and success, much as earlier Viking campaigns had done. The journey reflected traditions that stretched back centuries. Ships crossed the North Sea. Warriors followed an ambitious leader. England once again became the focus of Scandinavian hopes. Yet the world of 1066 was not the world of earlier generations. England was stronger than it had once been. Its rulers possessed greater resources and more effective systems of government. The conditions that had favored Viking expansion were largely gone. Harald's campaign would soon put that reality to the test. And the outcome would help define the end of an age. In September of 1066, Harald Hardrada's army advanced into northern England. At first, the campaign appeared successful. Norwegian forces won an important victory and seemed well positioned to strengthen their claim. But events were moving quickly. The English king, Harold Godwin's son, responded with remarkable speed. Gathering his forces, he marched north and surprised the Norwegian army near Stamford Bridge. What followed became one of the most famous battles in English history. The fighting was fierce, and by the end of the day, the outcome was clear. Harold Hardrada was dead. A large part of his army had been destroyed. The survivors retreated and returned home across the North Sea. For the people who lived through the event, it was a military defeat. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Communities in Norway would feel the consequences for years afterward. Yet historians often remember Stamford Bridge for a larger reason. It is commonly seen as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. Not because Viking ships suddenly disappeared or because Scandinavian society collapsed. Neither of those things happened. Rather, the battle marked the failure of one final attempt to achieve the kind of conquest that had once defined earlier generations of Viking leaders. The world had changed. England was stronger. European kingdoms were more organized. The opportunities that had fueled centuries of Viking expansion were largely gone. Of course, nobody standing on the battlefield that day could know they were witnessing the close of an era. History rarely announces such moments. Most people were simply concerned with survival, loss, and the uncertain future ahead. Yet looking back from the present, Stamford Bridge stands as one of history's great turning points. A moment when the ambitions of the old Viking world met a new reality. And the new reality prevailed. News of the defeat at Stamford Bridge eventually made its way back across the North Sea. For many communities in Norway, the consequences were deeply personal. Families waited for ships that would never return. Parents mourned sons. Wives mourned husbands. Children grew up without fathers who had sailed away believing they would come home again. The battle became part of local memory, carried through stories told around evening fires and passed from one generation to the next. Yet life continued. Fields still needed to be planted. Fishing boats still left harbor before sunrise. Markets still opened, and communities still gathered to celebrate marriages, births, and seasonal festivals. This was one reason the end of the Viking Age felt so different from the fall of an empire. There was no sudden collapse. No empty cities. No dramatic disappearance of a people. The world changed, but it changed gradually. Most people continued living in the same places their families had occupied for generations. They spoke the same languages, worked the same land, and sailed the same waters. What was fading was not the people themselves. It was an older way of life. The great age of overseas expansion was ending. Large-scale raiding became increasingly rare. The ambitions that had once drawn countless Scandinavians across distant seas no longer held the same place in society. New priorities were taking their place. Trade, agriculture, royal government, and local stability mattered more than they had in earlier centuries. Without fully realizing it, ordinary people were helping build a different future. And that future would look far more familiar to medieval Europe than to the world of the early Vikings. By the late 11th century, the Vikings had not disappeared. In fact, that is one of the most important truths in this story. The people of Scandinavia were still there. They continued farming, fishing, trading, and raising families much as they always had. Towns remained active, ships still crossed northern waters, and communities continued to grow. What had changed was the society around them. Christianity had become firmly established across much of Scandinavia. Churches stood where older sacred sites had once gathered worshippers. New religious traditions became part of everyday life. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden also grew stronger. Royal authority reached farther than it had during the early Viking Age, bringing greater political stability and tighter control over resources and territory. Trade remained important as well. Scandinavian merchants continued traveling abroad, exchanging goods with communities across Europe. The sea still connected distant lands, just as it had for generations. Yet these journeys increasingly took place within a different world. The age of independent raiders and explorers was fading into memory. In its place stood more organized kingdoms that were becoming part of a broader European society. For ordinary people, this transformation unfolded gradually. A child born in the late 11th century would grow up in a world that felt different from the one known by a child born 200 years earlier. Many traditions remained, but the values, institutions, and opportunities shaping daily life had changed. The Viking Age was ending not because its people had vanished, but because they had become something new. And over the generations that followed, that transformation would continue, carrying Scandinavia into the medieval world that was taking shape across Europe. As Scandinavia moved beyond the Viking Age, it became increasingly connected to the rest of medieval Europe. The changes that had begun centuries earlier continued to shape everyday life. Churches and monasteries expanded their influence. Christian holidays became part of the annual rhythm of communities. Religious institutions helped connect Scandinavia to a wider network that stretched across the continent. At the same time, towns continued to grow. Merchants bought and sold goods from distant regions. Craftsmen produced tools, clothing, and household items for expanding populations. Local economies became more complex and interconnected than they had been during the early Viking Age. Royal governments also became stronger. Kings exercised greater authority over their territories, collected taxes more effectively, and established systems that reached farther into everyday life. Power became less dependent on individual chieftains and more closely tied to permanent institutions. For ordinary people, many of these changes brought stability. Life still revolved around farming, fishing, trade, and family. The seasons continued to shape daily routines. Yet people now lived within a society that was more organized and more closely linked to neighboring kingdoms. The transformation had taken generations. No single event created it. Instead, countless small changes gradually reshaped the world that had once produced the Vikings. By this point, Scandinavia was no longer standing apart from Europe. It had become an important part of it. And as new generations grew up, the stories of great voyages and distant raids slowly began to feel less like recent history and more like tales from a fading past. As the generations passed, the Viking Age slowly moved from living memory into history. The stories remained, carried from one generation to the next. In villages across Scandinavia, older men and women could still recall tales told by their parents and grandparents. Some remembered stories of distant voyages. Others heard accounts of traders who traveled across vast networks of rivers and seas. But for younger generations, those stories belonged to a different world. A child growing up in the 12th century lived in a society shaped by churches, kingdoms, and growing towns. The great age of Viking expansion was no longer part of everyday life. It had become a story. The longships did not disappear overnight. Ships continued to sail northern waters, carrying merchants, fishermen, and travelers. Yet their purpose had changed. The sea remained important, but it no longer held the same promise it once had for ambitious young people seeking fortune beyond the horizon. Over time, memories of famous voyages grew larger in the telling. Stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Real events mixed with legend. Great warriors became larger-than-life figures, and distant journeys took on an almost mythical quality. Many people came to know the Viking Age through these stories rather than through experience. And in a way, that transformation was its own kind of ending. An age that had once shaped everyday life was now becoming part of the past. Yet even as memories faded, the influence of the Vikings remained visible across northern Europe. Their descendants still lived in the lands they had settled. Their trade routes had connected distant regions. Their voyages had expanded the horizons of the medieval world. The Viking Age was over. But its legacy was not. And so we return to the question with which we began. What happened to the Vikings? The answer, perhaps, is not what many people expect. The Vikings did not suddenly disappear. They were not wiped away by a single battle, a great disaster, or the rise of a powerful enemy. Instead, they changed. Over the course of centuries, the world that had created the Vikings gradually transformed. Trade connected Scandinavia to distant lands. Christianity reshaped beliefs and institutions. Stronger kingdoms brought new forms of authority and stability. Opportunities that once lay beyond the horizon increasingly appeared closer to home. The people adapted to these changes, just as people always have. Farmers continued working their fields. Merchants continued crossing the seas. Families continued raising children and planning for the future. Life moved forward. And little by little, the Viking Age became something remembered rather than something lived. That may be why this story feels so familiar, even after 1,000 years. Most ages do not end all at once. They fade gradually as new generations inherit a different world from the one their grandparents knew. The people often remain, while their customs, ambitions, and ways of life slowly evolve. If a farmer living in Norway during the early Viking Age could have seen Scandinavia 200 years later, much would still have seemed familiar. The mountains would have stood in the same places. The fjords would still have reflected the northern sky. fishing boats would still have ventured onto cold waters each morning. And yet the society around him would have felt different. New beliefs had taken root. New institutions had emerged. New priorities guided the lives of ordinary people. The transformation was so gradual that few individuals ever witnessed its full extent. Each generation experienced only a small part of the change. But taken together, those small changes reshaped an entire civilization. The end of the Viking Age was one example of a much larger human story. A story about change. A story about adaptation. A story about how entire societies can transform without fully realizing it at the time. Even today, the legacy of the Vikings can still be found across Europe and beyond. It lives in place names, languages, traditions, archaeological discoveries, and the countless stories that continue to capture our imagination. Their ships connected distant worlds. Their journeys expanded horizons. Their settlements left lasting marks on the regions where they lived. And their story reminds us that history is often shaped not only by kings and battles, but also by ordinary people making choices about how to live, work, travel, and adapt to a changing world. And somewhere along the coasts of Scandinavia, the waves still roll against the same shores they touched 1,000 years ago. The longships are gone. The Viking Age is over. But the people who once sailed those waters helped shape the world that followed. And that is why their story is still worth remembering. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you enjoyed our journey through the end of the Viking Age. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you a peaceful evening and a restful night. And until next time, take care, sleep well, and thank you for listening.